Today, population booms again as unemployment falls. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance and the latest well-noticed post covering finance and property news. Well, more releases from the ABS today, including the update on employment statistics, as well as overseas arrivals and departures in Australia, and also average weekly earnings. Australia's jobless rate ticked lower and employment rose, signalling the labour market remains tight. And that reinforced the Reserve Bank's cautious approach to policy easing. And there was some reversal of the noise that we saw in last month's data, but the jobs growth still looks a little weaker than earlier in the year. Now, it's worth reflecting on what Governor Bullock said in her recent press conference.
The forecasts imply that the cash rate might need to be a bit lower than it is today to keep inflation low and stable and employment growing, but there is still a lot of uncertainty, so the board will continue to focus on the data to guide its policy response.
Jobs data, of course, is crucial for the RBA's rate-setting board, as the resilience of the labour market and worries about it rekindling price pressures have been among the factors driving a cautious approach in the current easing cycle. The central bank has lowered borrowing costs 3 times since the start of the year for a cash rate of 3.6%. On Tuesday, Governor Michelle Bullock signalled a couple more cuts will be required to achieve the RBA's latest forecast after delivering that expected easing. The employment report follows data on Wednesday that showed wages growth remained elevated last quarter, rising 3.4% from a year ago, as I discussed yesterday. Now, according to the ABS, the seasonally adjusted unemployment rate fell to 4.2% in July, with employment rising by 25,000 people and the number of unemployed decreasing by 10,000 people. So the unemployment rate fell by 0.1 percentage points to 4.2% in July. Growth in employment was driven by full-time employment, which was up by 60,000 people, with 36,000 people falling from the part-time employment statistics. Female full-time workers grew by 40,000, while male full-time workers rose by 20,000. The growth in employment resulted in the employment to population ratio rising slightly to 64.2%, and the participation rate stayed at 67%. The female employment to population ratio and the participation rate reached 60.9% and 63.5%, respectively, both new historical highs. Hours worked rose 0.3% in July, slightly higher than the monthly employment growth, up 0.2%. And note, though, that monthly hours worked in all jobs is re-benchmarked annually in July, which resulted in minor revisions to the monthly hours worked in the July release. The underemployment rate fell by 0.1 percentage points to 5.9% in July 2025. That was 0.5 percentage points lower than July 2024 and 2.9 percentage points lower than March 2020. The underutilization rate, which combines the unemployment and underemployment rates, fell by 0.2 percentage points to 10.1%. That was 0.4 percentage points lower than July 2024 and 3.8 percentage points lower than March 2020. But it's worth noting that Roy Morgan's alternative approach, where they define unemployment differently, continues to go higher. Across the states, unemployment was highest in Victoria at 4.6%. It was 4.4% in the Northern Territory, 4.2% in Queensland and Western Australia, 4% in New South Wales, 3.9% in the ACT, and 3.8% in Tasmania. The trend unemployment rate remains steady at 4.2%. Trend annual employment growth has been faster than population growth for most of the past year, but has slowed in recent months to be in line with annual population growth in July, the ABS said. Now, looking at the sample rotation, June's outgoing group had unemployment at 3.9%, July was at 3.4%, while the July incoming group had a much higher 4.6%, so there is still some number wanging going on here. We can certainly say, based off the official data, warts and all, the labour market has been a bright spot in the economy though there are some signs more recently of slowing. Recruitment activity has come off, and the rate of job switching has eased more rapidly than other labour market indicators. That suggests workers aren't shifting jobs in search of higher pay at the same pace, typically due to less confidence about demand. Which takes us to the latest data on overseas arrivals and departures. Australia. These statistics report on the number of international border crossings rather than the number of people. The ABS says overseas arrivals and departures data, including permanent and long-term movements, should not be used as a measure of overseas migration. That data does not reflect the official ABS definition of migration and may lead to inaccurate interpretations. But that said, long-term and permanent movements showed a monthly net positive count of 41,946, comprising 95,137 arrivals and 53,191 departures. As Tarek Brooker on X put it, in the year to June, net long-term and permanent arrivals into Australia were running at their highest level ever. The year-to-date figure is 57.7% higher than the pre-COVID record high. Or, as Alex Joyner at IFM noted, a touch overshadowed by the labour force release, but overseas movements data seems to show that net migration is again on the rise. There was a significant spin-up in international student arrivals, with more than 33,300 arriving in June. This continues to put pressure on the demand for rental accommodation and other facilities like health and transport across the country. And overall, it suggests that we still need around another 30 to 35,000 jobs to be created each and every month to keep up with the broader job demand from migration. But of course, many of those jobs will be lower paid, perhaps part-time roles, but it keeps the employment stats bubbling on, at least for now. The other release today covered average weekly ordinary earnings. Now, earnings here are broadly defined as current and regular payments in cash to employees for work done, excluding amounts salary sacrificed. The reference period for the survey is the last pay period on or before the third Friday of the middle month of the reference quarter, like May and November. Where a pay period is fortnightly or monthly, the employer is requested to report only 1 week's proportion. Data is collected via online electronic collection, and follow-up procedures are in place to obtain information from respondents who did not lodge but completed a form by the due date. The target minimum response is 90% for the survey as a whole and approximately 85% for each state and industry. A sample of around 6,000 employer units is selected from the ABS Business Register to ensure adequate state, industry, and sector representation. They say this yields a live sample of around 5,600 units, and the responding employers in the sample account for around 4 million of the almost 12 million employees in Australia. The ABS reported that the average weekly ordinary time earnings for full-time adults was $2,010 in May 2025. That's the first time that average weekly ordinary time earnings for full-time adults has been greater than $2,000 on average. The growth of 1.7% in average weekly earnings for full-time adults for the 6 months to May 2025 was similar to the period of 1.8% in the wage price index for the same period. Annual growth in May remained high at 4.5%, a rise of $86.60 a week from May 2024. That was just below the annual growth rate of 4.6% in the year to November 2024. Average weekly earnings growth for full-time adults was stronger in the private sector, with annual growth of 4.6% compared with the public sector's 3.6%. The gender pay gap in average weekly ordinary full-time earnings narrowed slightly from 11.9% to 11.5%. That's the equal lowest gender pay gap in the series, with female average earnings rising faster than male earnings. Now, breaking out the data by public and private sectors and gender, we find that males in the public sector are paid significantly more than those in the private sector, on average, while public sector females, on average, earn close to the same as private sector males, and private sector females are bottom of the pack. Across industries, mining wins with males earning more than $3,500 a week on average, while females in food, services, and accommodation earned, on average, just $1,370 a week. And across the states, WA, powered by mining, of course, was top of the pack, while Tasmania was the runt. Finally, the growth does appear to be slowing just slightly, with the May movement at the aggregate level at 1.7%, but it does wobble around, so it's not that significant. It's also important to note that while average weekly earnings data can be used to compare at the very broad level average earnings between males and females, such comparisons don't take into account a range of compositional differences. For example, differences in occupation or hours worked can contribute significantly to the differences between male and female earnings. But it does show significant variations driven by industry, location, and gender, and underscores the rise in government jobs and government spending to supporting public sector jobs, while some sectors are still weaker, especially in the private sector. The flow of new workers, thanks to migration, will continue to keep a bit of a lid on real wages growth, which explains why we have tight employment, some, if patchy, wages growth, and real inflation still chewing up our dollars. Which brings us back to what Michelle Bullock said on Tuesday. If productivity remains in the gutter, wages growth will have to slow because the rate at which it can grow without inflation being stoked will fall. That's a very salutary message for those attending next week's Talkfest on productivity. And of course, we've still got the question again as to how much of this data is noise and how much signal. I guess we will see as we progress. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.